This is an oral history recording with Chaplain Lewis Long, and it's the first of a two-part interview because his roots are so deep in Lake Helen and West Volusia that it's going to take two sections to talk about all of them. This time we'll concentrate just on his own personal life and how he grew up in this area and what he remembers about Lake Helen. The interviewer is Jackie Kirsch, who is a WVHS volunteer. Today is December the 10th, 2015. The interview is being recorded at Lewis and Caryn's home in Lake Helen. Lewis, I hardly know where to start because you have so many stories to tell. But let's start at the beginning. How long have you lived in West Volusia?
Well, Jackie, I was born in DeLand in the old Memorial Hospital, and March the 4th, 1941. So, except for the 21 years in the military, this has been home. So.
And you've already covered where you were born. Where did you live as a child? You say you were born in DeLand. Did you also live in DeLand as a child?
Well, at that time, my mother's family, her grandfather had bought the house 2 blocks down the street.
And your mother was?
Jean Fletcher, and then Long. So they lived down there. Mom was raised by her grandparents, who moved here from Shrewsbury, Massachusetts, and she was raised by her grandparents because her mother died in childbirth.
Oh.
And then
and what were her grandparents' names?
Edward Fletcher. And Grandma Childs was really his sister-in-law because he had lost his wife, which wasn't totally unusual back in the day to,
oh no,
you know, there were, but
a lot of women died at childbirth.
Yeah, Mom witnessed her father being thrown by his horse. He was a graduate of Harvard College of Law, but he was thrown by his horse and died of a brain concussion. So her grandparents moved down here. Her grandfather was a former mayor of Worcester, Massachusetts, but he came to Lake Helen and he loved Lake Helen, and he started the first Chamber of Commerce in Lake Helen and things, and very involved here. So, but they were 2 blocks down that way, and so my parents lived down there. So they brought me home from the hospital in DeLand, lived down there until I was about 5, I think.
And what happened when you were 5?
Well, they moved to DeLand, bought a house up in the University Terrace there on North Amelia. We moved there along with our menagerie of animals and the bird dogs and the cat, everything but the goat. We didn't take the goat. And it was interesting moving there because those houses had basements and things like that. It was quite different than the house down there. That house was built by J.P. Mace for his son Loring, in the cypress mostly on the outside, beautiful woods, arts and crafts style house.
And J.P. Mace was?
J.P. Mace was a renowned architect from the Cincinnati area, and he was a friend of Henry DeLand, came down here, and then actually Mr. DeLand commissioned Mr. Mace to build this house where we are right now. And then Mr. Mace, it was called a winter cottage. Mm-hmm. Those houses back then were winter cottages.
No matter how big they were.
Right. Well, because the big homes up north were usually much bigger.
Oh, yes.
But he lived here when he designed and built his own home, the Edgewood, down the street. And it was called the Edgewood because it was at the edge of his orange groves. There were orange groves everywhere, and some peach orchards as well. And Mr. Mace had a shipping plant down where the railroad ran from New Smyrna Beach to Orange City. So they had the packing plant down there. J.P. Mace was our first mayor in Lake Helen. There was one other owner here, Rastus F. Gould. And we know he was a very wealthy man because his divorce cost him $50,000. An awful lot of money then. And when he died, he had interest in Florida and Georgia and back up north in Connecticut. So it took a while to settle the estate. But what happened, grandmother's parents rented it until they could buy it. So grandmother was 9 years old when they moved into this house.
This house?
This house, yeah.
Okay, but yours was 2 blocks, your
My
original
parents
home
were
was
2 blocks that
down.
way, both built by Mr. Mace. Yeah.
And we talked a little about your mother, but what about your father? Who was he?
Dad was Lewis Jr., and he was born in the little house next door. And I have the deed over here, both sides of it. It's from Mr. DeLand to grandmother's grandmother. My grandmother eloped at 17 with my grandfather, Lewis Sr., who was a race car driver at Indianapolis and a test car driver for Packard Motors. So her papa, Grandpa Bond, he wasn't real thrilled about that, but Grandma's grandmother, in the language of the day, told him in so many words just to get over it. And her grandmother bought that lot from Mr. DeLand and then had that little house built in a rather a hurry, and it was given to them for the first Christmas they were married. And Murray Louise, their daughter, was born there. Dr. Barecki, the woman doctor that we've done on the cemetery walks, was the physician. So Dad was born there as well. And yeah.
And how did your mother, it's fairly obvious how your mother and father might have met, but how did they meet?
Well, they, of course, yeah, grew up in the same place here in the area. My father did go to Georgia Tech, though, and Mother went to Stetson. Mother was a fine arts major at Stetson, and Dad went to Georgia Tech, engineering.
Rambling Wreck.
But he went in the Merchant Marines during the war. And he grew up partly in New Smyrna Beach. That's another story too, but he and Uncle Maynard, all of them were part of the Indian River racing crew, and they beat the college kids and all, but yeah.
Did you have brothers or sisters?
I have one brother and one sister. Margaret's the sister, Raymond's the brother. Margaret lives in South Florida, Raymond still lives in DeLand. Yeah.
What are since you really grew up in this area, what are some of your fondest memories of growing up in this area? What was it like to be a small boy in Lake Helen or DeLand?
Well, like I say, like you said, there's a lot of memories there. Really, DeLand was the hub of our activities. You went to DeLand for, to go to the the big grocery store.
Yes.
You went to DeLand. I used to enjoy going to Fountain's men's store, buy clothes and shoes over there at VM Fountain Shoe Store. You go to the Smith and Thomas drugstore, and later it was the G.G. Smith, and they just had everything in there, from Wrigley's big bath soap, to candy, and along with your prescriptions that you bought. And so DeLand was, they were like the hub in the wheel.
They were the big city.
They were the big city, and some folks in DeLand kind of looked at us a bit of being country bumpkins, and we were maybe more on the wild side here in Lake Helen. But my grandfather, Long, when I was here in the 4th grade, my dad died a day before my 8th birthday. And it was bittersweet because I lost my dad, but I had presents from everybody in DeLand, it seemed like, in Lake Helen for my birthday. And I still have somewhere my first pocket knife that was given to me by the constable, Bill Slaughter.
Oh.
Yeah. But I came to live with my grandparents, and really it filled a need for both me and them.
Yes.
Because my grandparents had lost their little girl, Murray Louise, in the flu epidemic, 1918. And that's that epidemic that wiped out so many people worldwide. In fact, when she had her graveside at Oakdale, her grandfather and the pastor were the only two people well enough to be there. But so they lost Murray Lou, and then World War II, my uncle's plane and his crew went down flying the hump and went down in China. And I can still remember when the Western Union guy came to this door with the telegram that he was missing in action. That was really tough.
So they had lost all of their children.
Yeah, that was really tough because if he, died, and that's one thing, but not knowing was something else. And it was in the early 50s, some missionaries found the wreckage in China, so they buried the whole crew together at Jefferson Barracks, whatever remains there were. But yeah, then Dad died. So I came here, and I was here in the 4th grade at the school. There were 10 of us in the class, 1 girl, 9 boys out here. And I remember being in the play, Tom Sawyer, and I was Tom Sawyer. And we go outside, and it was a wonderful life. Everybody be out in the playground. Some activities were organized, some of it was free play and that sort of thing. After school, you'd go across the street to Hyde's store. It had the big Coca-Cola advertisement mural on the side, and underneath it had W.E. Hyde Groceries. We used to kid, about Mr. Hyde, we Hyde Groceries. But you go into the little store, the front part was screened in, and you walk through, and they have the 2 big bananas hanging on like they come.
Yes, on the stalk.
On the stalks. Outside, you'd have a bench, and people would sit and chat. There was a lot of visiting and chatting and things, socializing in the community. That was one big difference back in the day. You go inside the store, and the DeLand Sun newspapers would be on the counter, and Mr. or Mrs. Hyde would write the name, and ours, of course, had Long on it, and you'd find your paper. It was on the counter every day. And then they had where you could take a Pepsi or a Coca-Cola or whatever soft drink out of the thing with the ice, and you could sit there and drink your soft drink. It was about a nickel. And Mr. Hyde was always proud and advertised that he sold Western beef instead of the Florida beef. It was tougher. And he had the great big wooden chopping block with the sawdust on the floor, and he usually cut your meat to order. And if you had dogs or whatever, he'd give you free leftovers. Didn't throw away anything. Or if you ate liver, he would give the liver to you for free. He never sold his liver, kind of thing. And one big treat was, on a real hot day, if he let you walk in the cooler where all the meat were hanging, because it was nice and cool in there. And in a sense, that was our first exposure to air, except for the Athens or the Drika Theater. And sometimes I think people go there to cool off as much as see the movie. But yeah, it was really neat. And it was a different world.
Do you remember who your teacher was in the 4th grade here?
Oh yes, Anna Maud Shockley. And she was named for 2 favorite people in her family. First thing she told us. She was from the Shockley family over in Altoona. And she usually went home on weekends to Altoona. She was the principal as well. And as I say, there were 10 of us in the class. One memory that sticks out there was in the cloakroom. You had 2 doors on either end, and the telephone was in the window side of the cloakroom, and it was one of those wind-up, and we were part of the Orange City telephone system. So there were some painters painting the front of the school, and they were on a scaffold, and the scaffold fell, and the 2 men came on the ground. So the teachers were out there holding covers over them to shade them from the sun, and Miss Shockley was in there ringing and ringing, trying to get the operator in Orange City. And we didn't have ambulance service, medical services in those times. So it was Allen Summerhill, the funeral home. You know, they brought the ambulance, I mean, that they used for,
The hearse.
The hearse, yes, so to come and get them. And, you know, we all couldn't help but look out the windows, and really had never seen a disaster quite like that, and we were fearful for their lives, but they both made it through okay. You know, you'd see them around town later on. But there was, like when my grandmother taught school there, some years she'd have first grade. If there were enough students that year, sometimes she'd have first and second in the school.
And that was Lake Helen Elementary School. That was what it was. And there was also a colored school, right?
Mm-hmm. Over on Goodwin in Washington. Mm-hmm. And lifelong good time friend Henry Whites was principal over there, who was Reverend Whites, who was also our vice mayor later on for many years in Lake Helen. And we corresponded over the years when I was in the service. Just always kept up with each other.
How long did you live with your grandparents?
Well, I was here that year, the 4th grade, and they got the first man teacher in the elementary schools, Mr. Newby, Robert Mitchell Newby. So the family thought it would be a good idea to have that male influence in school. So I moved back home and started back to Boston Avenue, just as if nothing had happened in a way. And those memories are wonderful as well, because Miss Larimore, our 6th grade teacher, lived up a block away from us. It was Hayden Avenue then. It's Burt Fish Drive now. Her house is still there. But we'd walk to school together, you know, Boston Avenue. Well, Mr. Newby taught the phys ed classes for his class and Miss Larimore's. So we'd have him for PE, and then Miss Larimore would teach us music. So when I had Miss Larimore in the 6th grade, it was reversed, and we still had him for, you know, playground, and Miss Larimore for the music. So then I came here, though, in the 7th grade. So that's really from then on, and this was really where I was at. Mom had a degree from Stetson and fine arts, and with my dad dying, you know, she needed to do something, so it was going to be teaching. Well, you had to have the credentials to teach courses that she didn't have at the time. So she was going to Stetson, and then that summer she went to Gainesville to finish up. The 3 of us lived here while my grandmother was going to Stetson. So we had Annie Hall was here to take care of us, and she had worked for my great-grandparents and my parents, Grandma. And Grandma used to remark how when she'd drive in the driveway home from Stetson, Ann had her umbrella and her purse and everything. She was ready to hightail it out of here after the morning with the 3 of us here. But Mom needed to intern then, and there was only one art teacher in Fallucia County, Harold Yates, over at Seabreeze High School. So Mother interned under him, and then they got married down here at the Congregational Church. And yeah, so, but Hal was be neat, behave, be Navy. He was, yeah, I mean, quite frankly, he was a disciplinarian. I wasn't quite used to that. And,
7th graders.
So we all agreed I'd come here. This was home after that, and we all got along and everything, but it worked out for everybody.
Yes.
Everybody. So here we are.
And you went to high school at DeLand High School? I
was at DeLand High School. Had driver's ed, and one of my fondest memories there is I just wasn't really adept at numbers. Things like algebra and geometry, and you know, it wasn't my forte, but I was so blessed to have Betty Ford for my algebra teacher. She knew how somehow to present it in a way you could grasp it. You know, it's just starting with whatever's on this side has to be equal to this what's on this side.
Right.
You know, just to start with that. And I still have my report card. I made 3 A's and 3 B's in algebra from Betty Ford. But I enjoyed driver's ed too. You know, I just love to get in the car and drive, and any excuse. When I had a learner's permit, I said, "Grandma, let's go to Orange City and eat over at Hard Tongue's restaurant so I could drive." Yeah.
Do you remember when you first rode in a car?
Well, don't remember, but I've got moving pictures when my dad picked Mom and I up from the hospital and drove us to Lake Helen.
Okay.
But yeah, I remember, must have been about 3. When the war broke out, Dad had an economical Ford. Mm-hmm. And this friend of his had a big V8 practically new Cadillac, which was a gas guzzler, and now they're on rationing.
Yes.
So Dad made an even swap. We had a Cadillac. And I remember that Cadillac, because not many people had Cadillacs, not around here. So yeah, I remember the Cadillac, and I remember when we lived down the street, you had to put the kerosene in the back of the stove, and you'd go down to Mr. Hyde's, you'd take your can with you and turn the thing and fill it up and then take it back. I remember that. One reason was because it could be so cold.
Yes.
You know, and you get out from the house to the car and you want it to get warmed up. Yeah.
You didn't go directly from high school to Stetson, did you? You went somewhere else first.
Oh, well, we had a monk come through town from the Order of Holy Cross. They were Episcopal monks, and a lot of us didn't know the Episcopalians had monks in monasteries, but they did. And he met and convinced Father Lawson that it would be a good place for some of the boys to go. St. Andrew's School in St. Andrews, Tennessee, was a school for boys, which was near Sewanee. So there were a group of us, about 8 of us, I think, from DeLand, and we went up there, and I still had an entrepreneurial spirit, if you will, because I'd been a DeLand Sun News paper carrier by this time. So when the paper route became available, Chattanooga Times, I stepped up and had the paper route, which meant I had to get up an hour early and everything before school and do that. And I had a wonderful year there. Tom Bryce from Orange City was the head prefect. It was a school where the boys did all the jobs. It could be for working in the dining hall or the kitchen or doing the janitorial work at the school or carrying the food up to the monks at the monastery type of thing. And they had Civil Air Patrol, they had the link training, and it's the first time I was on a track team. Of course, going up the mountains and around, you know, you built up a good heart rate. Yes. And on a rainy day, the old school building was 3 stories high, so you go up the stairs 3 flights and then across and then down. So I was on the track team, and then I got to play tennis. I had never played tennis, so I enjoyed that. And and Vicki Fleischel was from over at St. Margaret's School, so she's from DeLand, and so when we had dances and things, that was always kind of neat. And I went back in the 10th grade, but then very frankly, I just had the longing to come back home. So I came back and started with the spring semester back at DeLand High School. Well, then, you're facing the thing about going to college, right?
Yes.
Well, there really wasn't any thought of going anywhere else except Stetson. Grandmother started there when she was very young and rode her horse home here on weekends. Old Barney was out in the barn. And then Mother had graduated from Stetson. So Mr. Tuttle, Farr Tuttle, was the director of admissions, and after a conference with my grandmother and me, he said, well, you really need to brush up, fine-tune some of your academics. I was interested, I really liked ancient history from being at St. Andrews, and we had Latin and all those things, but some of them, I just wasn't, academically inclined always. So I went over, they had started a new school at Howie in the Hills, and he knew Dr. Miller, who was the president, Howie in the Hills, Howie Academy. So I went over there the last part of my senior year, actually. Enjoyed that, learned to water ski and do horseback riding, and was in some plays over there, including one called Opening Night. I was Cornelius Otis Skinner's husband, and there was a scene where you get sick, and a lot of people thought I really was sick. I had to do that and leave. We had great teachers over there. It was a good experience. And then, so after I graduated, well, we got a trip to Cuba. The Spanish teacher was Cuban, Major Arjabay de Resti. So we went to Cuba on a senior trip. And so when I went into the Air Force later on, every time, because I had to check I'd been to a communist country, so he'd always pull me aside and interrogate me about that. But I was accepted in what Stetson called the College Skills Program for the summer. You didn't get any credit for it, but you went there, and it was to prepare you for college. So two of my roommates, well, my first roommate at College Skills, and then later another one, we've been in close contact all these years. They became Presbyterian ministers, and of course I'm Congregational UCC, but we've kept in touch. And so I went to Stetson, and I enjoyed it, and then I discovered I liked back then they called it Christianity 1 and Christianity 2. It's religious studies now.
Yes.
But I really enjoyed that. But I still didn't know what I wanted to do. I felt rather aimless. So one day in God's providence, I'll say, I was sitting on the swing out there, and my neighbor across the street's grandson was home on leave. Now the probability factors are next to nothing, because I didn't sit on the swing that much. Grandmother did. But the timing was when he came out. I went over and I talked to him. His name was Ronnie. It's 15 minutes later, I decided I'd go into the Air Force.
And how did your family feel about that?
Fun. They were fun. So I went into the Air Force. And actually, I had to wait to report. I had 3 months to wait. So Sidney Taylor, our family attorney and lifelong friend, asked me if I wanted to work at the West Volusia title and abstract company with Mr. Boyne, and I did. And that whole thing was a remarkable time of learning for me. I not only enjoyed it, I'd spend my lunch hour in the big vault looking over old abstracts and searching property records, because all the history's there.
Yes.
All the history, friends. And you'd see somebody in DeLand driving their new Cadillac from Bill Holler Motors, and of course you think, and then I'd see 2 weeks later the mortgage would come through on their house. They borrowed the money to buy this Cadillac, so very revealing. So I had that experience, which paid dividends later on. When I went into the Air Force, Lackland Air Force Base, 4 days I was there. They came through and said, the president's been shot. And my first thought was, what a dastardly kind of a thing to pull on us. What in the, what are they trying to do? Well,
You thought it was a scam.
Well, they didn't use that word so much then, Jackie, but it was like, geez, what have I gotten myself into? Well, when the TI came through and, there was a tear or two in his eye, he said, whoa. And then they brought us radios, which we weren't allowed to have. And sure enough, found out President Kennedy had been shot, 4th day into training. Well, completed the training, and then they give you a town pass to go to San Antonio, see the real world again. And then, of course, all the caveats: do not be late getting back to the base. Don't miss the last bus. And I'm the more cautious, prudent type, so I took an early bus. And I reported into the orderly room. And then God's providence again, there happened to be a chaplain there, Episcopal chaplain, talking with one of the airmen about the need for volunteers to work in the chapel. Well, I went up and talked to him. I said, nobody mentioned it to us. I didn't even know that they needed them. Of course, they don't give orders to work in the chapel. You have to volunteer. So he gave me a phone number and said, if you're interested, we'll set up, have an interview. So I went back to the barracks. We had 2 TIs. One of them was very good at drill and ceremonies, and actually they assigned him there because he'd been busted, reduced in rank a couple of times. They wanted him to be able to reach his 20 and retire.
Oh.
So they put him with Sergeant Carr, who was a really fine, kind of a spiritual man, I'd have to say. And I spoke with him since I'd gotten back early, and he said, if you're interested, I'll make the phone call for you. So I said, okay. So next morning, I said my prayers, walking over there, had my interviews, and had my orders changed. Of course, the old sergeant in the orderly room had warned me, says, don't be trying to do that. You're going to, blank yourself over and this and that and the other. And I had been scheduled to go into accounting and finance. But I worked in the chapel. First assignment was Keesler Air Force Base. And one of the brand new chaplains there with five sons at the time, new chaplain, we've maintained our friendship all these years as well. And then I went from there to Japan, Itazuki Air Force Base, Japan. Now, what happened in Japan was the boss, the Methodist chaplain, and his wife had a son my age back in the States. And they kind of adopted me, because their son was in college in the States, and they adopted me. And then our Catholic chaplain, Father Stevens, was a product of Boys Town, Nebraska. Knew Father Flanagan personally, and he was an author, and he was very intellectual. Well, after the time there, it got to where I could no longer say no to being a chaplain. So I came back home with that vision or idea in my mind to work toward going back as a chaplain.
Yes.
And I had the GI Bill, so I could go to Stetson and finish up, and I made the dean's list and honor roll after that.
And then how long were you a chaplain?
Well, Caryn and I both had 21 years, so subtract 4 years enlisted from the 21. It wasn't all active duty, Jackie, because at the time I got through seminary at Lancaster in Pennsylvania, which was another story. I mean, really,
Too bad we don't have a whole book.
Really, I was accepted at Yale, and I went up there, but I felt like a duck out of water with everything that was going on there at that time during the height of the Vietnam thing and so
protests.
on. And our pastor here in Lake Helen had a dual ordination. He was Dr. Schultz with us. He was one of 5 pastors that we know of who was ordained. He was Eastern Orthodox Catholic Church in America, and the reason being because they needed a man with his credentials as to be their dean of academics at one of their seminaries. So he grew the beard, had the collar, used to tell us where the West went wrong, But he invited me to an ordination in Orlando one afternoon, and the ordinand was going into the Navy, and the man who gave the charge was from Lancaster Seminary. So on the way out, I said, send me an application. So, but during that time after Vietnam, when they were throwing people out, the reduction in force, they weren't taking new chaplains. So this friend I'd met early on at Keesler was at Air Reserve Personnel Center. So he calls, how'd you like to go? I was a chaplain candidate and then ordained down here at the church where I was baptized, attached to Patrick Air Force Base, and that's where I met John Smart. He was our boss down there. Les calls, says, how'd you like to go to Greenland? Yeah, went to Greenland to fill in. Came home 3 days later. How'd you like to go back to Greenland? This time to Thule. Yeah, went all the way within 80 miles of the North Pole on one of those trips to take, we used to call them the garbage runs because they had all the salads and stuff and fuel. Came back, how'd you like to go to the Azores? Garden of Eden. Filled in the Azores. So I'm meeting all these people all over and going all these places. And then, again, in God's providence, we had the first woman chaplain in the United States Air Force, Lorraine Potter. She was credentialed from Yale to teach clinical pastoral training. So the chief of chaplains, who was Roman Catholic, went along and says, okay, we'll set up the program at our largest medical center at Wilford Hall in San Antonio. Never, ever, ever crossed my mind anything to do that was related remotely to a medical situation or setting. But out of the 6 slots, they had one for a reservist. Did I want to go? I went. Changed everything again. It was stressful at times.
It was serving in a hospital.
It was, you put in, I forgot how many hours, but, lots of hours, and doing your verbatims and being totally upfront with one another, where you could do better or not. My problem was I had to learn to be a little more confrontational. I found that out pretty soon. They said, Bud, you wait till the sessions are about over, and then you drop the little thing for us, and we have no time to deal with it. So, when you visit a patient, you go and introduce yourself, say, I'm here to see how things are going, and that's it. You have to find out about what their needs are.
Yes.
But I had that training, which I wouldn't have had otherwise.
Yes.
So when a slot came open, I spent half my career in medical centers.
Yes.
Largest in the world during Desert Storm, I think.
Goodness.
Yeah.
And you also met your wife
Met
in
Caryn.
service.
I had come back from 13 months above the Arctic Circle in Alaska. I was at Wright-Patterson. Caryn was our new squadron commander when we met. So, yeah, and when we went to functions like the Hail Farewell every month, where you say goodbye to those leaving and welcome to those coming in and stuff, and we had squadron functions like Valentine's dances, and my boss's wife kept suggesting I take Captain Gove and all, and then we eat together at the club. We were both single, and then Caryn, she was at the Episcopal Church off base, but she came to the Bethel series that I taught on Saturdays. I had a big group. And when I got orders to Germany, the past experience was you get to know different ones, and then somebody gets orders and leaves.
Yes.
So I started inviting Caryn to come down to Lake Helen. And after about the 3rd time, she finally said, okay. We laugh now because she said at first she thought I was going to try to sell her some property down here. See, well, because I'd brought Chaplain Smart here to Lake Helen. Colonel Kennedy from Alaska bought property here. Chaplain Jaron bought property here. Just to bring people to Lake Helen that
Yes.
I thought would be great to have in Lake Helen. And so Caryn came down, and I just knew that if I didn't propose and we went our separate ways, it might be the end of that relationship, and I didn't want it to be.
Yes.
So I got her down here, and I proposed to her, and she accepted, and then we went up to St. Augustine. Yeah. Actually, I took her over to St. Barnabas Church and show her the church and everything.
Yes.
So we were inside, sat down in the
DeLand.
pews, and that's where I proposed.
Yes. And you all have children.
The oldest is Lewis Clark Long IV, but he goes by Clark, so there's less confusion that way. And Clark is back from Afghanistan now, and he's at Stetson on the GI Bill. He's a senior there. Our youngest, Chase, did the reverse. He graduated from Stetson first and then went into the Marine Corps. And he is a first lieutenant now, and he has been in Iwakuni, Japan, the last 2 years. Actually, we went to visit him over there last Christmas and New Year's, but he will be home in about 10 days from now. The next day we get on the auto train and go up from Sanford to Lorton and visit, and then he will be reassigned to, of all places, Garden City, New York, Long Island. We didn't know the Marines had anything like that there, but it's a reserve base, so he'll travel, taking care of reserves. So we're very proud of them both, and they can both be proud of themselves.
You all retired here, And were you coming back and forth to Lake Helen over the years as you
Yes.
served?
Yeah, and I had different folks from time to time, whether it was friends from town who needed a place for their parents to stay, could stay here, or second cousin stayed here until he had to go to a nursing home. So, and then again, Gary Millie Adams, they were in our Sunday school class at Wright Pat, and he had to find a place to move to off base. He was retiring, and every Sunday I'd say, well, you're welcome to go to Lake Helen. And then the last time he says, well, we don't have a car down there. I says, well, I've got my '69 Javelin in the garage. You're welcome to use it. They came here 8 days later. They bought their house behind the Congregational Parish House. So, and Gary served on the Planning and Land Development Regulation Commission for years, almost 20 years.
Yes.
So, you know, yeah, I connected a lot of people with Lake Helen over the time, yeah. But it was, we came back by choice, Jackie.
Yes.
When you consider year-round living and where, because originally Caryn would have retired in Virginia where she graduated at Mary Baldwin, if she hadn't married kind of thing. But we came back by choice, and then I got involved. I was on the Planning and Land Development Regulation Commission, and then I was commissioner and vice mayor. And those were the times when we had to fight hard to keep Lake Helen Lake Helen.
Yes.
I mean, we did. We were an onslaught from all sides. People, they wanted to come up here and remake us into another Miami, South Florida. They come here to get away from that, and then they start one, you know.
When you came back here to live, what had changed the most, do you think, from the time that you were growing up as a child here?
Well,
how much had it changed?
There was no Saxon Avenue, for example. Like that Orange City completely changed. Back in the day, there was a little competition between Lake Helen and Orange City. They had 800 people, we had 600, and it's who's going to get what first, and yeah, kind of thing. But we were blessed by the fact that we didn't have any major highway going through Lake Helen like Orange City did with Fallucia Avenue, which is 1792, which they keep expanding, kind of thing. And then, you know, what's happened over there. I-4 does go through the corner of Lake Helen, but it's on the edge of town. So that worked out pretty well. But we're the only town on the I-4 corridor now that's anything like an old Florida town. And I first got on the commission, and there was a group coming in here and buying everything up and paying way more than it was worth, because I remember asking Terry Acree why they sold the family land after all those years, and he said, Lewis, it was just an offer we couldn't refuse, kind of thing. And we got Mr. Findell, our administrator, who had been planning the planter at Orange City. Then we found out our comp plan hadn't been approved by both Volusia County and the state. And Volusia County being a charter county, we had to have both, so we were set back 10 years. So the first thing we did, Don suggested, was turn Main Street into a gateway corridor to protect us. So that's why we have the fire station that's not a metal building. It's more in keeping with the Victorian architecture with the little porch and all. And we have the woods of Lake Helen. People didn't always agree in Lake Helen, philosophically or politically, but we did know what we didn't want.
Yes.
So when we had tables of 8, did the questionnaires for Mr. Findell, sent a representative up to give our take on it, we knew what we did not want. So, and that's where we've worked toward.
Yes. When you came back here, I would guess that one of the things that influenced you was the house itself, which you had inherited from your mother, correct?
I was the first man to own this. Because back in the day, it was in the woman's name. So if the husband had business reversals or gambled or whatever, they couldn't take the homestead.
And that's very unusual, I would think.
Some of the folks that came through on the home tour, we tell them that, say, hey, some of the women say, I like that idea. But it went from my great-grandmother to grandmother. And back in the day, you had to own land to run for political office.
Yes.
So when they drafted grandfather to run for mayor, they deeded the little house next door to him so he could do that. But actually, when I got my first assignment as a chaplain on active duty, that's when my grandmother had Mr. Taylor, Sidney, deeded over to me, and she told me that I could take care of it from now on. I mean, it really is. These people say, "Oh, you own this old house," you know. No. They own you. They always want something. So yeah, grandmother actually gave it to me before she died.
Yes.
Yeah.
And tell me just a little bit about the house. You said, for example, that the chimney, the inside of the fireplace is built with what we now call bond brick. And we'll talk more about that in the second segment. But what is it around in the house that just makes you feel like this is home?
Well, I've spent every New Year's from the time I was 1 all the way up right here. When Mom and Dad went out and celebrated for New Year's, I was always here. I got to a point, where I ventured away. I might run away to the garden club park next door to where we live, but then when I was riding my tricycle, I got brave. I'd ride up here from down there. Or maybe as far as the Edgewood Groves in time. But it's always been home, even though I might not have been, full-time here. It's always been part of the family.
Yes.
And a big part. Think about the stories. My grandparents, and dad and uncle would be out here on the front porch to watch the Harlan Hotel burn to the ground. Things like that.
That was Henry DeLand's son's
Harlan's,
hotel.
Yeah, named for, yeah. And just, there's so much history right here. But when the house was built before we had a mill, before the bond brick and mill. And you see that burley pine out there, which you don't see much at all. But the only thing really changed is we took the 2 pantries in the back, because Caryn said unless I wanted to do all the cooking, she wanted everything in one place, because the icebox was in one pantry, the stove was over here, the sink was over here, kind of thing. But one big change is right behind you. The original mantles were pine and had a curve in the front. Well, Grandfather Bond did business with Flagler and St. Augustine a lot. So when he was up,
Henry Flagler.
Henry Flagler, and so the egg and dart that you see up on the mantle, all that, all came from St. Augustine. That was one of Flagler's favorite designs you see all over the buildings in the college, and so that was put on the front. One of the strongest attributes of the bond brick was its resistance to fire. And even if a building like Stover Theater was built with what they call common brick on the outside, which was clay-based, all the inside was the bond brick.
Yes.
Because if you have fire, the walls didn't crumble. And also, they could put the plaster right on the brick. You didn't have to have lathing. So all the plaster in old Stover was in. But so that was all lined with the bond brick. And even though this house was built before the brick plant, 1904, I think, from the center all the way through under the living room, the dining room is all bond brick, because the Northerners didn't realize that without footers under the house to hold it up, they would sink. They'd gradually give way in the sand. So Grandpa Bond had those put through. They're down there, and then the brick in the chimney,
yes,
kind of thing. Yeah. But it's just, like that lamp up there, I don't know, you can't see it, but all the lights and water were put in 1912. I've got a letter somewhere around here from the Philadelphia Museum of Art wanting to buy that thing back in 1970 or somewhere back there.
That's a Tiffany lamp.
Well, the globes are. The lamp itself is hammered brass. I guess it's part of that arts and crafts movement. And it was one of the first indirect lights, because you see the light goes up on the ceiling from inside. The little globe in there has a name of a manufacturer in Chicago. So, yeah.
It's easy to see how your life just kind of revolves around this house. If you were talking to a young person today who was thinking about leaving Lake Helen and never coming back, what would you say to them?
Well, strangely enough, or not so strange, a lot of people find their way back.
Yes, yes you did.
Along with the new folks. Seriously, they do. I have this perspective, very strong perspective, that people, I like to see the good in people, Jackie. I've always, and I have faith in people if you give them a chance. So, like with our own sons and people I counseled, I always tried to differentiate and to come across that you're not a bad person. You're not a bad person. You're a good person. We dealt with behavior and choices. We might look at a person's behavior, especially if they've been sent over there for doing something, quote, wrong, unquote. Mm. My big question was always, is this helping you? Your behavior, what you've done, is this helping you in some way? To try to, weigh that. And then we had what we call the SOC method, SOC. Whatever your situation, you have at least two options, the O, even if it's not to do something. Your situation, your options, your choice. Well, what are the consequences? So, and it's like with our two sons, we never came across you're bad boys. No. Your behavior might be questionable. And it was, is this helping you? Specifically Clark or Chase, is this helping you? Or not. So I think having some sense of self-worth and learning to, make choices.
Yes.
Weighing it out, make a choice.
And all choices have consequences.
Very important.
Thank you so much, Lewis. It's been great to look back, and we'll look back some more in the second segment.
And thank you all.